Hi, hi DLD community. Hi, my dear friends. I'm Steffi. I'm your host today, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our first edition of DLD Sync, a show we will be hosting weekly. Professor Galloway will be our next guest on in a week. But now we have a different topic than marketing. As you know, in times of global social distancing, we are all missing the famous human touch. We social beings looking each other in the eye, connecting with friends and business partners. I miss it. But now you are here. You are here with me, and I'm speaking into a computer, hoping that you're all here, listening to me and listening later to Frey and Karsten and to the very relevant topic we will hear. But now, let's start with new times call for new ideas. As you know, our core topic is and was always to connect the unexpected by exploring, discussing, and examining the unstoppable force of, you know it, digitalization. This is the topic of DLD since 15 years. Digitalization has swept across our global over the last 2 decades, leading to unprecedented change in our personal lives and behavior, in the economic sphere, in politics and society as a whole. But now we are faced with a different kind of paradigm shift. A virus. A virus impacts our world in an unforeseen way, and we are all trying to deal with this realization, with this sudden realization. There are two things that I'm very certain of. First, the world after Corona will, in many respects, be radically different to the one we knew only 6 weeks ago. Very, very different. Everything has changed within 6 weeks, imagine. Second, digitalization will play an integral, sorry for my English, it's always an integral role in shaping this new world. Of course, we all hope it's for the better. So while many of us are still in lockdown, while we might already be facing the first small impact of this global crisis, I'm so happy to reach out to you digitally and be connected with you, dear DLD community. I heard we have 1,000 registrations for this talk, for this very first DLD Think. Now we are all forged together by curiosity and willingness to not just understand the ongoing change of our world, but also to actively add to the shaping of new realities. Our DLD motto this year is, most of you know, what are you adding? So let me ask you all, what are you contributing to help us deal with this situation of crisis? What can we add in terms of personal engagement, in terms of ideas and resources? What should we focus on? And which argument and viewpoint can we add to the global discussion? What can you add to take away fear, to take away lethargy, to be silent and to be lame? Please engage. Please dare to engage. Awake, awake. DLD Think wants to wake you up. Let us gain some new perspectives, some new ideas. Let us be inspired by the ideas and insights from our community members. Let's synchronize our thoughts and add value. It's so important to add value and stick together, listen to each other, to get connected, not only on DLD Think. Dare to ask questions inside this talk and outside. Dare to call us, dare to ask questions. So for the first edition of DLD Sync, we have invited long-term DLD friend Benedikt Frey. He is an Oxford Martin City Fellow at the Oxford University, where he directs the program on the future of work at Oxford Martin School. I'm very proud that he's a friend of mine. Not only of mine, but from the DLD community. Many of you probably know Karl's work from his 2013 study he co-authored with Michael Osborne on the future of employment. How susceptible are jobs to computerization? Where he then estimated that almost 50% of our jobs, of all current jobs, are at risk of being automated in the near future. This was 7 years ago. 7 years, it's a whole eternity. Last year, he published his latest book, The Technology Trap, which examines the impact of artificial intelligence on labor, capital, and power from a historical perspective. Karl has also spoken at DLD for the first time in 2017, where he then discussed perspectives on the future of work together with Munich's Cardinal Marx, Catholic Cardinal Marx, Demis Hassabis from DeepMind, famous DeepMind, Yonja Brunini, our good friend of Google, and Janina Kugel of Siemens. So today, we are looking forward to tapping his expertise when it comes to what the future of work will look like after the pandemic. What did it do to us? And whether there are parallels to similar situations in history. Karl, welcome. I'm very glad to have you as our first DLD Sync speaker.
It's great to be with you, Steffi, and thanks for having me again. What a better place to kick off the first conference digitally than at DLD. You're the most digital place I know, and it's fantastic to be part of your community.
Thank you so much, Karl. And since, as you know, we're very much like conversational formats at DLD, Karl will be in conversation with Karsten Lemm. Karsten is our journalist in residence at DLD. He runs our news site and develops new content formats together with the DLD team, my wonderful DLD team. Hello, everybody from you. Karsten is a business and technology writer based in Berlin. He used to be a senior editor of Wired Germany, where he focused on topics as AI, future of work, mobility, biotechnology, and sustainable development. Karsten is also a Silicon Valley insider, where he spent 16 years as the correspondent for Stern magazine in San Francisco. So please, my two friends, go ahead. The floor is open.
Thank you very much, Steffi, for this generous, wonderful invitation and introduction. Sorry, and Karl, again, welcome. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you who have tuned in. As Steffi said, we want to draw some parallels and also look into the future. Karl, this pandemic, of course, seems to us completely unparalleled. We have seen the economy virtually collapse around the globe, millions and millions of people being furloughed, laid off, whole branches of the economy collapsing, like the travel sector, airlines, etc. When you sort of zoom out and look at this as an economist, is it as unparalleled, or do we just have to go back 100 years, for example, to the so-called Spanish flu of 1918 to see something similar?
No, I think it is very different for a number of reasons. First of all, obviously, the virus means that people can't go to work because of the risks of being sick. The virus means that consumer can't go shopping because the risk of contracting the virus. And that means that both supply and demand both have collapsed simultaneously. And businesses who want to keep running, who need cash flow at a time when liquidity is disappearing, all of a sudden can't get access to credit because businesses don't want to lend in a is essentially based on the prospect of future revenue, which doesn't exist at the moment. So government action has been completely decisive in actually mitigating this crisis possible, and didn't happen during the 1918 pandemic. Government have stepped in to provide liquidity, to guarantee loans, and also cover the wages for people to be able to remain in employment. That wasn't the case in 1918, and it's important also to remember that the 1918 pandemic happened in the middle of a world war, and also in an economy that wasn't nearly as interconnected as the one we had today. And even then, the virus spread quite rapidly from port to port through trade routes, and as troops moved around. So the bad news, if you like, is that the virus today has the potential, or has already spread much more quickly than it did back then, because we are also interconnected. The good news is that we have better technology to deal with the disease itself. During the 1918 pandemic, scientists didn't even know it was a virus. Most people thought it was a bacteria. And because the virus is roughly 1,000 times smaller than a bacteria, scientists weren't even able to spot it with the technology of the time. We also have much better healthcare. We had much better social safety nets to take care of people, and we are able to interact digitally. A lot of the interactions that we do happen virtually today, which wasn't possible 100 years ago, and that is something that, at least for today, has mitigated the burden of this crisis.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful sort of 360-degree view of the current situation. I should say that all of you out there who have tuned in, you should have an easy way of asking questions. We're collecting questions. And after sort of about 20 minutes or so of Karl and me going through some basics, then we really want to, we look forward to your questions, and we want to answer them. So friends, colleagues behind the scenes are collecting and curating it a little bit in case we have overlaps of different questions, but please send in your questions, and then we'll get to them. We already have a few that were submitted in advance. Let me quickly, Karl, get into this issue of the connected economy. It seems like this tiniest of organisms has managed to basically bring the whole world to a standstill by essentially piggybacking on this connected economy, people traveling, goods traveling. Also, of course, much of the productivity gains over the past decades have been because of on-time delivery, optimizing here and there, constantly squeaking out the last bit of possibilities for productivity gains. Have we over-optimized perhaps our economy so that it's become very brittle and more susceptible to disruptions?
Yeah, I think we have over-optimized our economies. I think we need to be more just in case than just in time in terms of delivery. We knew this to some extent because during the Fukushima crisis, business in Japan shut down. A lot of automotive producers in the US couldn't get the components they needed. One particular color, silver metallic, was produced very close to Fukushima. And if you look at the painting of cars that year, very few are of this particular color, silver metallic. So we know that this can have an enormously disruptive effect. People have been warning us for a pandemic, which is a much bigger event than Fukushima was, in the sense that the entire world is affected. And people have been warning us for a long time. I remember when I first arrived in Oxford about a decade ago, Larry Brilliant, who helped the WHO eradicate smallpox, was here to talk about the grave threat the pandemic presents, arguing that it's very likely that it's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. We've done very little during that period of time to actually prepare for it. And I think there are a couple of things that we need to do when we look over our supply chain. First, as I said, we need to be more just in case rather than just in time. Businesses will need to have a greater inventory. That will mean, somewhat higher prices for consumers, but that's worthwhile paying. Supply chains also need to become a lot more diversified. Roughly 90% of antibiotics in the US today come from China. That is not going to continue to be that way. And those supply chains need to become more diversified. And I also think, to some extent, we are going to see more reshoring of production closer to domestic markets. And that is not only to save transportation costs, but because we are also in the middle of a trade war, and US-China tension are escalating almost by the day. So Trump has been sort of advocating for this decoupling since 2015. It's now basically a consensus view or a bipartisan view in the United States that needs to happen to some extent. I hope that it doesn't happen to a too large extent, because we should be extremely grateful also for these supply chains, which have made us a lot more prosperous, which have allowed us to share technology across countries in a way that has boosted the world economy. So I hope that will continue, but we will need a little bit more fat to be more resilient in terms of the inventory that we keep.
And which role do you think can technology play if this pandemic really becomes a kind of catalyst for these trends that had already begun earlier? Which technologies do you think can come into play to make this happen?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that trade has always been driven by technology. So the first wave of globalization in the late 19th century was a direct consequence of steamships for the first time becoming sufficiently energy efficient to be able to transport goods from England to China. Much of recent globalization has been the consequence of the container and computer and advanced communications technology, which has allowed US and European firms to locate production in China and to coordinate supply chains at distance. What we're seeing now with advanced robotics and 3D printing is that those technologies increasingly allow companies actually to save transportation costs and move back production home. We're also seeing that that trade has actually declined since the Great Recession of 2008, but the services are becoming increasingly tradable. So goods have been in decline in terms of volume of trade. Services have continued to go up. So clearly, digital particularly crucial, and improvements in virtual reality, telepresence, all of these technologies are going to allow us to export more services over huge distances. So clearly DLD and the digital community is going to be key in facilitating such interactions.
Mm-hmm. Steffi mentioned your study back in 2013 with Michael Osborne, where you both predicted that up to 50% of all tasks jobs could be eliminated because of automation. Can you give us an update? How do you see that today?
Yes, I think I haven't changed my views on that. I think that a significant share of the workforce is potentially exposed to automation. And I should say, though, that what we did do in the paper is to look simply at sort of the pie of employment today, how many of those jobs are potentially automatable, merely from a technological capabilities point of view. We have a section in the paper where we discuss sort of the factors that will drive decisions to automate, which ranges from relative costs between capital and labor. When Nissan produces cars in Japan, it relies heavily on robots. When it does the same thing in India, it relies heavily on cheap labor. Legislation is going to play a key role. Google Translate is becoming better and better by the day. But unless you get Google Translate to become certified, it's not going to be valid in translating certain types of documents, which need to be certified by a human translator. So legislation is going to play a role in this as well, and potentially worker assistance, which have featured in history on numerous occasions, where Luddites in 19th century Britain tried to smash machinery to block the introduction of machinery they believed threatened their jobs. And we've seen similar resistance to more advanced robotics in the United States in recent years.
Which areas do you think, where will we see the biggest investments in automation once this pandemic either progresses or even when we go back to normal, like many people are hoping?
So I think one domain which has proven to be a bit of a bottleneck during the crisis has been in warehouses. So you see that Amazon and other companies have benefited a lot as e-commerce has been through the roof. But warehouses are still very crowded places. Those are hazardous places for workers in terms of also spreading the disease. And rightly, workers have demanded better conditions. They went on strike recently in Staten Island, in New York. But I think one of the consequences that these companies are going to draw from that is that we have to automate warehouses more to make them sustainable, even during a pandemic. And one of the reasons why warehouses are still so labor intensive is that order picking has been largely a manual process up until now, but robots' hands are becoming much more dexterous. Artificial intelligence allows or makes it possible to better distinguish between different types of objects, and for robotic hands to identify them and manipulate them. So I think that is a domain where we're going to see automation progress particularly rapidly over the next couple of years.
And of course, we have a European champion in a company in the UK, Ocado, if I pronounce this correctly, which specializes in essentially building whole warehouses that are constructed to fulfill the needs of the robots rather than having shelves for humans to pick out things. It's a kind of a grid with 3D lifts, and these robots are via smart algorithms directed in a way that you get maximum efficiency out of many robots just automatically collecting these items. So that to me is always a fascinating example of European ingenuity at work, which is now being used by Walmart, for example, in the US as well. Any other industries that come to mind where you would say companies will not forget this as easily as they did maybe Fukushima, and they will now invest in modern technology in order to decouple their processes from future disruptions?
Well, I think telemedicine is a no-brainer. I think one of the main hurdles in the US for that has actually been legislation up until now, so due to privacy concerns. Doctors for a long time prohibited from interacting with the patients using digital technology. Those hurdles have now been lifted, and I think they're probably likely to remain lifted. The sector which I am in myself, and I'm sure is going to change. We are going to do a lot more online as a result of this, and that's a good thing, right? I think a lot of people have been blaming, or not blaming the internet, but suggesting that the internet hasn't fulfilled its promise so far in terms of boosting productivity the way that electricity did, or the internal combustion engine did in the early 20th century. I think that very few people today doubt the virtues of the internet, of digital technology. And I think healthcare, education, those are two of the sectors where we've seen slow productivity growth over a long period of time. They are huge chunks of the total economy, healthcare in particular. And I think anything that can spur productivity growth in those sectors, which digital technology has the potential to do, is going to also spur productivity growth more broadly in the economy.
Well, telemedicine is a wonderful segue into an area that probably many of us right now have collected a lot of experience in, teleworking, remote working, home office, all of these things. Do you expect kind of these cultural changes, that they will be here to stay, that people will, and companies will also say, you know what, there are a number of benefits, maybe even no lost time to commuting, for example, just work from home. We can save also office space if not everybody's present all the time. What is it that you see there again once the worst hopefully will be over?
No, I think that some of this is going to stick. I think this has been a tendency for some time now. We've seen a lot of different experiments in the Chinese call center, for example, where some workers were randomly chosen to work from home, others were randomly chosen to stay at the office. Looking at the levels of productivity 9 months later, what you find is that people working at home actually were much more productive, and that they reported higher levels of well-being. And we've seen similar studies for a variety of companies. If you look at things like co-applicants on patents, you see that the distance between co-applicants on patents have increased enormously since the introduction of the web. But what you also see, though, is that many of these co-applicants tend to meet physically at conferences. So in years where conferences have been cancelled, you see lower levels of patenting. So physical connectivity still matters. Nobody lives in cyberspace. Most of our emails are with people that are actually based in the same building. We are still social beings. We want to be around other people. But I do think that we're going to see more things done digitally. And one nice example, so I have a colleague here at Oxford University who did a paper a couple of years ago where they looked at a strike on the London Underground back in 2014. And during this strike, there were a couple of underground lines that were closed, so people could no longer take their usual route to work, and they had to experiment and find new routes. And what they find is that 5% of people actually stuck to their new routes thereafter and cut their commuting time as a result of that. And the benefits from those 5% finding a better way of doing things every single day for many years to come, those benefits were larger than the short-time disruption. Now, I think the disruption of this pandemic is obviously much, much greater. But I do think that there is a minority of companies that's going to change the way they work in permanent ways. And that is going to have a long-lasting impact on productivity growth. It's going to cut commuting patterns. It's going to cut emissions in transportation. And all of those are very good things.
Would you say that technology can already really substitute for much of what we do in a workspace, in an office. I'm thinking, for example, of water cooler talk and the serendipity effect. You just bump into a colleague and start talking about something that you never even planned to, but out of that comes maybe a great idea. How do you substitute for that when everybody's basically connecting online at a as needed basis?
No, I think that's right, and you can't substitute for that. Regardless how good the digital technology is, somebody needs to switch on the computer or pick up the phone. You don't have this sort of type of spontaneous types of interactions that happen in offices, which are important to bonding, which are important to the exchange of ideas. And that is why I think that we're never going to see the end of the office, right? We've been through this numerous times before. When the first telephones arrived 100 years ago, people predicted the end of the office. Back in the 1990s, with the internet, people predicted the end of the office. There's not going to be an end to the office, precisely for the reasons you mentioned. But I think what this pandemic shows is that there are a lot of things that doesn't require those type of sort of spontaneous interactions. You don't have to be necessarily at the office every day. Much can be done by distance. What we're going to see is more being done by at distance, but not everything.
When one of the biggest trends, of course, in recent years, when you look at how we work in offices, has been open plan offices and co-working. Both of these are now in the light of the coronavirus pandemic, the mental change, cultural changes, I see big question marks over that. So I'm curious, I've read, for example, that some architects are already coming up with ways of sort of drawing little demarcation lines around desks to signal people, stay away from your colleagues in a nice way, don't get too close. That more and more companies will probably put in automatically opening doors, especially to bathrooms, things like this. But I'm wondering how you would, for example, look at a company like WeWork and say, is this trend going to be reversed, or will we forget?
Well, I think there are a couple of separate questions in this. I think the open office was a mistake regardless of this pandemic, because most people, yes, they want to interact with their co-workers and colleagues, but they don't want to share their ideas with everyone in the building. So we still need private spaces for people to interact. And people also have sort of different space requirements for different types of tasks. If you're in the process of thinking up a new product, you may want to speak to a lot of people. If you sort of settled on what you want to do, you need peace in mind to actually sit in a place undisturbed and actually get things done. So I think that sort of trend towards the open office was a mistake from the onset, and I think that is being reversed. What's happening with WeWork and other of these places is that, yes, there are a lot of people working on related things that can be in the same building, and that is a good thing, because what these places do is that it helps you to filter down ideas. If I go up to the Martin School and I have sort of 10 of the best economists and 10 of the best engineers and so on in the same building, what they read, the people they speak to, all of the best ideas are getting filtered down to me through that process. And that is what offices and cities do. It helps filter down ideas. Artificial intelligence, by the way, to some extent does that as well, right? So we've been dealing with this information overload with the internet since the 1990s. And what artificial intelligence does is essentially matching the best pieces of information for us, right? So whether it's a book recommendation on Amazon or a movie recommendation on Netflix, or whether it's a dating app or whatever it is, it's all basically matching and trying to filter down information. So there may be some less need for that matching effect as well as artificial intelligence becomes more pervasive. but I struggle to believe that it would ever completely go away.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We get a lot of questions from our viewers. Thank you very much for participating. We get a lot of questions with specific regard to certain industries. So people are very interested in what your take is, for example, in the future of the hospitality industry, tourism, media, publishing, retail. Let's maybe roll this up into a little bit of a list of winners and losers, likely losers that you see. And I think we have to look a little bit beyond the immediate moment. For example, if we open up the economy again, if we can safely do so, will people immediately start traveling again? Will they hop on cruise ships? Will they go to restaurants, etc.? What is your take?
So I struggle to believe that we're going to go back to normal, if it were. We're probably never going to be back to completely normal. I think there are a number of things that will change as a result of this, as we've already been discussing. But before we have a vaccine, I very much doubt that people are going to travel as normal, that people are going to go to restaurants as normal, that people are going to interact as normal. And something that you see with the 1918 influenza pandemic, for example, is that places that were hit the hardest by this, social trust declined, and you saw effects decades after that. So I think that the hospitality and travel is going to be very hard hit by this. And unfortunately, that is going to exacerbate some of the tensions that we see in the Eurozone, because Italy and Spain are the places that already have been hit the hardest by this pandemic. They are also highly specialized in these particular sectors, very reliant on those. Italy has debt to GDP ratios which are not sustainable. And we're going to need European solidarity to deal with that. Some of the research that we have done suggests that there are a lot of jobs that can actually be done at distance. Financial industries is that with the highest share of jobs that can be performed remotely, somewhat around 80%. Leisure and travel has the lowest percentage, far below 10%. And more broadly, what you see, unfortunately, is that it's the high income jobs that are least affected by this, and it's the low income jobs that are being hit the hardest. And I think, unfortunately, in the short run, this pandemic is leading to increased polarization of the labor market. That said, though, Bill Gates described this pandemic the other day as a world war with everybody being on the same side. And I think we should all be hopeful that we end up being on the same side, that we learn from this, and that we approach this in a solidaric way going forward.
You just spoke about Europe and the need for solidarity. Do you think we've seen enough of that? When you look, for example, at rich countries helping the not so rich ones, the ones that have been coping well, helping the others that are in dire need of help, have we seen enough? What could and what should politics do?
Well, I think what politics need to do is to preach the concept of solidarity. I mean, you can't, go into this and then, with a nationalistic approach and expect to come out of this crisis afterward and everything goes back to normal. And unfortunately, what often happens in the recession is that there is greater competition for resources. Citizens obviously expect their governments to provide for them. Governments are, in the first instance, elected by those citizens, so that's obviously rightly so. But there is always an aftermath to everything, and people will still remember, for example, during the 2009 swine flu, when Australia was early to develop a vaccine and had to fulfill domestic orders before exporting it to the United States, which caused a lot of concern in the US. And I think, this time around, we will see who develops the vaccine first. But I think it's going to be critical to have platforms like CEPI that make sure that, the vaccine is distributed to those in need rather than those with the biggest wallet.
Well, the big wallet is a good touch point, because even countries, wealthy countries, of course, are doling out billions and billions of euros and dollars. And the question then becomes naturally, how much of this can we afford? How much support should governments give? For how long can they afford it? Because before potentially there's an enormous risk for the economy in general of runaway inflation or whatever else might be the result.
Well, I think inflation is not the key concern. So what's happening after this crisis is we'll have accumulated a lot of debt. Hopefully that debt will go onto the balance sheet of the sovereign, and we hopefully will be able to inflate it away at a modest rate over a long period of time. But history tells us that it's actually quite hard to get inflation going when the economy is not doing particularly well. And I think the lesson from a pandemic is that the world economy, which is hyper-connected today, is only going to be as good as the weakest link. And what you saw in the 1918 pandemic is that the virus in the first wave came from the US, came from Kansas. It was an American virus. It should be called the American flu, not the Spanish flu. It had nothing to do with Spain whatsoever. And it spread across Europe and essentially over time disappeared. And then they come back from the US a year later in a much more deadly version of it as it mutated. And I think, this time around, we're hopeful that is not going to happen in that way, but, there's likely that it's going to be a second way. And if we haven't dealt with this in developing countries, could easily come back from those places as well. So the economy is only going to be as good during a pandemic as the weakest link, and we need to deal with this globally, not in a nationalistic manner.
Mm-hmm. And you said, the gist of what you've been saying is that a lot of people, for example, in countries like Spain, Italy, who work in the hospitality industry, even in other countries, of course, will likely be out of a job for a longer period of time. We already see in the US that millions and millions of people are out of work. You mentioned in an article for the Financial Times that we may actually have to consider a universal basic income. Please explain.
Well, I was actually careful to say basic income because I don't want it to be universal. So I'm more a believer of something what Milton Friedman called a negative income tax, which essentially provides a floor that you sort of income can't fall below that, and you can sort of top it up by working, and that sort of floor shouldn't be enough to sort of support yourself in a very comfortable way. You still need incentives to work, and there is no reason to pay a basic income or make it universal to people that don't really need it. But I think as we come out of this pandemic, as measures that subsidized jobs now expire, what we're likely to see is an acceleration in automation. And we saw this during the Great Recession, as sort of in downturn, businesses tend to want to cut costs. They automate more. Cash-strapped consumers want to buy cheaper goods and services, so they tend to opt for services that have been produced using more automation, as was discussed earlier. Warehouses and so on want to pandemic-proof the operations. So that is going to accelerate automation as well. And as we discussed as well, when social trust deteriorates with the pandemic, you may even want to interact with technology rather than another person, at least sort of temporarily for some time. So I think all of this is likely to spur automation. Our research suggests that it's the low-income jobs that are at most risk to automation. It's where most young people work today. And I think in order to avoid social unrest, I think we need something like a negative income tax.
So in other words, however you want to do it ultimately, but we need a redistribution of the of wealth and of the benefits that come through automation, if I understand you correctly.
Well, I think it's important to remember this. It depends on which country that you're discussing, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at Sweden, we have quite developed social and safety nets. Germany have recently developed ones as well. If you go to the United States and you're in the midst of a pandemic and you find that your health insurance is tied to your job, but you don't want people to go to work during a pandemic, you have a problem. So obviously, we will have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. But, in Italy and Spain, things look rather grim. And I think something you may need to stabilize the Eurozone is sort of a European unemployment scheme or some type of European basic income. If we want to maintain the Eurozone, I think there is no real way around that over the long run.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We have a question here which fits in nicely, whether maybe because of automation and all the other things we talked about, there might even be a 4-day work week in the offing. What do you think?
Well, I mean, something that we do see over time is that economies grow richer. They, opt for less work, and we have more holidays today than 100 years ago. We work shorter hours and so on. And, maybe at some point we're going to want to opt for even more leisure. John Maynard Keynes predicted the 15-hour work week 100 years ago, and he was actually quite on target about how rapid productivity growth would rise over the next 100 years. But he was actually very much not on target what the work week concerned. And I think most people, especially on lower incomes, prefer to work a bit longer to earn a bit more. And I think the key concern is actually going to be to get people to get to work and make a good living rather than cutting working hours. It's something to certainly consider, and for some people it will make a lot of sense. But introducing now legislation for 4-day work week, I would be happy about it personally. But I'm not sure if that it would be a good thing for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Another question from our community concerns the set of skills that will be required, that you see in particular in demand, as being in a particular demand in the near future. Anything that you can generally say there?
Well, I'm not sure if this pandemic is going to change the skill sets we need that much. Obviously, if more things move digitally and into the cloud, we're going to need more digital skills. I'm sure we're going to want to invest more in our healthcare systems, in our health services. We will need related skills for those sectors, doctors and nurses, so on and so forth. So those are clearly skill sets that will be need, but those were skill sets in need even before this pandemic too.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back briefly to working from home, because you talked about this earlier, that you can be more productive, as studies have shown. On the other hand, of course, that means you can't be distracted all the time. What should basically the society, the government do in order to provide conditions so that people can work from home? And tied into that, would that maybe also allow more women to participate in the economy even more so than what we see today in most Western societies?
Well, I think if you look at families who have children during this pandemic, and if you look at families who don't have children during this pandemic, you will find that the latter group has been a lot more productive. The first group have obviously done a very important work, which is investing in their children, which is hugely important. But I think something you will need to do is to have, decent childcare, decent school for children to go to, for people to be able to work at home productively in the first instance. I think that is going to be absolutely key. Then there are a lot of discussions to be had around health and safety. I'm not a lawyer. I don't wish to go into that in detail. I think it will be different in different countries too.
So this is far out, but could you imagine essentially robots taking over some childcare if sort of a traditional kindergarten childcare system like what we see right now is not an option simply because the risk of infection is too high? Can machines fulfill these kinds of tasks that are heavy on emotion?
I haven't seen any childcare robots so far. I know that in Japan they use robots to some extent in elderly care, but I wouldn't want a robot looking after my children. They lack the dexterity to prevent them from doing silly things. They're not particularly good in interactions. They lack our emotions and social intelligence and all of it. So no, I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon, at least.
Yeah, sounds like a relief to me. Let's go into leadership. Actually, there are some who argue that leadership on the management level will completely have to change because of essentially the almost traumatic experiences that many managers have these days. For example, the Economist wrote recently that like the cinema audience at a horror movie, executives scarred by COVID-19 may forever be bracing for the next jump scare. And so a big change may be to produce a cohort of managers who are more risk averse. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think we need more risk-averse managers necessarily, but what we definitely don't want is that, if we have the stock market has been on its greatest run in history up until this pandemic, and what we often see, and we saw before the Great Recession as well, is that when things are going well, businesses tend to or managers tend to do a lot of share buybacks, which inflate their own compensation. And then when the crisis hits, there is not much left in terms of liquidity to support the business during rough times. And we can't have a system where you see executive compensation on the rise during good times, and then during the bad times, we're all in this together. So I think that we will definitely need to see a shift in mentality from sort of short-termism to more long-termism. I think resilience is clearly going to be a theme after this pandemic. Whether that will require a change in leadership mentality or a change in legislation or a bit of both, I think is still open. But businesses clearly need to become more resilient. That is not, to blame businesses for the pandemic. And clearly, many restaurants and small businesses closing down, and the airline industry, how it's being affected. Wouldn't blame them for not foreseeing this. But it has been a recurring theme now during times of crisis, that we need to we need bailouts, but then during the good times you see a lot of inflated compensation, and I think that needs to stop. I think that has been feeding into the populism that we've seen over the past decade, and it's not good for society more broadly.
Mm-hmm. A recurring theme in the general debate right now is that perhaps this pandemic is a good chance to basically take a step back, evaluate how we do business, where we are as a society, as a global society, of course, as well. And then not forget about climate change, for example, but rather take this as a moment, as a wake-up call for a general rethink of how we do business, which would bring us back, of course, to the question of should we have globalization, ship things, goods and parts 3 times around the globe sometimes before they are turned into products. What chances do you see for doing things differently and in a better way in the future, or will then the cost cutting and the general crisis of the economy actually rather lead to these kinds of discussions being squashed?
Yes, I think there are a couple of things here. I mean, as we discussed earlier, I do think there's going to be a shift towards more remote work, which will cut transportation costs and cut emissions, and that is a very good thing. I also think there are going to be some reshoring, but I mainly do think also it's going to be sort of looking at more diversified supply chains. The economy and consumers have benefited enormously from globalization, and giving people at lower incomes access to goods that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in places like China. It has contributed to a lot of knowledge and technology transfer across the globe because of these integrated supply chains. So in balance, I think they are a good thing. That said, we clearly need to do something about the climate. I've been advocating a carbon tax for a long time, along with all my economist colleagues, but that is not going to be enough. What we also need is a huge technology transfer program of clean energy alternatives to China, to India, to Africa, to these places that are expanding and growing more rapidly, and that is responsible for most of these emissions. So I think tackling climate change is not primarily sort of a question of buying local where you live. Tackling climate change will require international collaboration and enormous investments in renewable energy, in particularly in the countries where most of the pollution is happening.
Very good. So I'm looking at our time. We have a couple more minutes, and so that this doesn't become a downer. I wonder what gives you hope, what makes you optimistic when you look at the post-coronavirus pandemic time.
Well, I think what strikes me is that we had 2 world wars and a Great Depression in the 20th century. And after decades of fighting each other, people in Europe are now friends, right? And I think, that after a pandemic, which, we're all in this together, I think it's also time to come together. And I think that I'm hopeful that we'll see more initiatives like CEPI from Bill Gates, which is a platform to make sure that the benefits when we develop a vaccine that is widely shared and distributed. I think we're going to need more similar initiatives for other key technologies. So I'm hopeful that we're going to come out of this in a more united way. But, being hopeful is not enough. We need to, also make the case for that. And, I've been trying to do my bit today, and, hopefully others would do their bit too.
Mm-hmm. If you look beyond yourself, what can each of us do? Is there anything simple?
Well, as Steffi said, the motto for DLD this year is, what are you adding? So that's why I've been thinking about what I'm adding myself, and I'm not sure if it's always encouraging to think that way, but I think it's important to think that way. And I'm in no position to say what people should do to add value. I think people should need to figure that out from themselves, and on the basis of what they are doing and what they can do.
We probably all have our strengths and our certain domains where we have talent and are something that others appreciate, whatever we can contribute. So I think that's a wonderful idea, that we can also take this as a moment to think about what we can contribute to make this better, this whole situation. Thank you very much for your input, Karl. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you all out there. Sorry for steamrolling you there. Thank you very much for joining us for this first DLD Sync, and I'll hand it back over to Steffi.
Thank you, Karsten. Thank you, Steffi.
Thank you, Karl. This was a very good first DLD Sync. I think it made us think. And thank you for concentrating your work, your humanistic work, to the DLD community. Thank you, my dear DLD Sync listeners, for being at the computer, looking at us, looking at Karl and Karsten, and I hope that you learned something, that you learned and you feel more engaged. What Karl just said, please add something to this process. Add something to the thought of that our time will see an acceleration of automation. This is what I learned. And what is our role in this? How do you cope with it? What are you doing it? How do you teach your children? How do you teach your co-workers, your bosses? What are you doing? What are you adding? I leave you with this, and now have a nice analog evening. Thank you. Ciao. Scott Galloway next week, Tuesday. It's really cool. I call him the digital poltergeist, marketing poltergeist. You will have fun there. Thank you. Ciao.